Hi, thanks for listening to the podcast. This is my first episode of what's going to become the Life Force Labs podcast. I'm talking today with Ali Houston. He's a ketogenic coach. Is that what you call yourself? Ketogenic life coach, lifestyle coach. And he's doing some research at Oxford in the field of metabolic psychiatry. So, looking at how metabolic parameters can be influencing psychiatric symptoms and mental health, specifically ADHD and depression. So you and I came into contact just through kind of conversations I was having about my interest in breathwork and kind of my shtick about reframing breathwork potentially as a metabolic intervention, because I think it's an aspect of my work in breathwork that's not talked about that much, is the role of oxygen delivery and metabolism, and how a lot of functions in the brain and body are actually regulated by metabolic constraints. And so I was talking to someone about that, and they mentioned you, metabolic psychiatry, and your work with diet-based interventions. So we met and had a really interesting kind of conversation about the framework of metabolic psychiatry. So I just wanted to kind of start off by asking you, like, from your perspective, like, what is metabolic psychiatry? What is the kind of foundation of the principles of metabolic psychiatry? And what about it is offering a bit of a frame shift or like a paradigm shift in terms of understanding um, psychiatry and understanding biology more as an interconnected systems through the body.
Yeah, sure. So I think metabolic psychiatry is about applying principles of energy production to psychiatry. And, my friend and mentor, Georgia Ede, says studies have shown conclusively the brain is in fact part of the body. And obviously she's being facetious, but you hear some of the stuff that researchers and doctors come away with sometimes, you wouldn't think that that was the case. And I think what is good for the body tends to be good for the brain. Why would it be any different? So energy production is key, and that's what metabolism is all about, how we take in stuff from the world around us and produce our tissues and energy from it. So that's it in a nutshell. And it's complementary to existing psychiatry, which is really centered around primarily pharmacological treatment and psychotherapy. And I think what's important to say at the outset is that it doesn't supplant these things, and that these modes can be super helpful for people, life-saving in some cases. My experience in this is very personal. I went from, at 8 years ago being a kind of miserable physics PhD student to almost overnight, it was within a matter of weeks, losing my symptoms for ADHD, chronic anxiety. And then I was worried at the end of that summer that I would get my seasonal depression again, which I had every year as far back as I could remember, and it just didn't come. And that was 8 years ago, and it's not come again. So, you know, I felt metabolic psychiatry before even the name was created. And Georgia Ede, again, she was around back then, blogging, and there was maybe one or two other quiet voices in the space, but no one really being loud and proud about it except her. And, she would say that in her years of practice before that, drug therapy and psychotherapy combined could help people to maybe go back to work or finish their university degree. These aren't nothing, these are huge things, but that with nutritional therapy, metabolic therapy, people could just get better. Serious mental disorders could just heal. This is almost unheard of for things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder. It does happen, but this was happening on a regular basis for her. And she's been beating that drum for a while. And I, kept telling people what had happened to me, but there was almost like a suspicion that I must have been exaggerating or making it up or something. until a couple of years ago when the Bouzouki family, David, the father, co-founded a gaming platform called Roblox. I think anyone with young children knows what that is. Massive corporation, and their son has bipolar disorder. Used to have, crippling bouts of depression, suicidal when he was at home, and then would run away thinking he had magic powers, and they wouldn't know where he was. They would lose contact with him. It was so scary. And they're obviously very well resourced, so they tried everything that they thought they could until they met Chris Palmer, who is a Harvard-based psychiatrist who's been using metabolic psychiatry principles in his practice. He suggested, why not a ketogenic diet? He went on a ketogenic diet, and that's in 3.5 years now with no bipolar disorder symptoms. So about a year in, they realized there was definitely something there, and they started to fund this research. And I think this question of why it's a paradigm shift and why it's so revolutionary to see this as an holistic practice is that it goes a step deeper in a sense than drug therapies and psychotherapies do. Take CBT, for example, which sort of seeks to catch those negative thoughts and put them on better rails, right? So you can categorize them a little bit more efficiently for your life. But the thoughts still occur, right? You can train yourself to an extent, but thoughts still occur. Or drug therapies which act on particular pathways. And we were just talking about this before we started, how there is no smoking gun biomarker for mental illness. People are looking for them just now, but that if you don't really know what the biomarkers are, then what chance do you have of creating really robust drug therapies?
Right.
And psychiatrists say when they ask someone if they want to go on a drug, they really have to be honest and say, I don't know what effect it's going to have on you. There is this study or that study which shows that it may have a better effect than placebo, but that's about it. And you just have to suck it and see. Whereas I think what metabolic psychiatry tries to do is go a step deeper and say what might be a root cause of these disorders. And what you so often find is people with mental disorder symptoms have some other metabolic dysfunction. They might be pre-diabetic or diabetic. They might have overweight or obesity. They might have gut problems. And the list goes on and on. And
Yeah.
what you very often find is, yes, and what very often find is that these things clear up at the same time, which is a really good sign that you've got a root cause solution rather than just a sticking plaster. So yeah, hopefully that's a good overview.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. I think, part of the paradigm shift for me and part of how I'm thinking about it in terms of, breath work as a metabolic intervention is really starting to think about metabolism as almost like a fundamental limitation in biology. Like there really only is so much energy that the body can produce and process at a time. And if there is a metabolic kind of dysfunction or a dysregulation in the body's ability to produce its own energy, then there's a wide-ranging effect there's so many different things that can go wrong, so many different downstream effects of processes that can go wrong, depending on, what else is happening in the internal environment and the external environment, other systems that are interacted with the kind of metabolic system can start to just like have dysfunction. And then because of the integrative kind of systemic nature of the body as a system, which is trying to maintain homeostasis, trying to find balance through these dysregulations, there's going to be all of these different effects cascading from what potentially could be metabolic dysregulation in the first place. For example, like mitochondria, which produces energy, plays a role in neurotransmitter synthesis and neurotransmitters. And so like if you're having an issue with not being able to produce cellular energy efficiently, that's going to hugely affect the way that chemical signals are sent through your brain. So really looking at like a step deeper just provides an understanding of I think the body and provides a new kind of integrative way of looking at biology in general, which I think you said it's complementary to traditional psychiatry, but in a way I kind of think also provides a systemic understanding of it that can also lend itself outside of the body. Like we're also looking at interacted systems, one of them being the psychosocial environment. So like, for example, if you have someone who's like in a really traumatic situation or a really like horrible situation, a ketogenic diet's not going to potentially solve that situation for them, but potentially going to, feed some energy into the whole system that could provide support, that's not just a band-aid, that's like really acting on a more systemic way.
Absolutely. And this biopsychosocial model is so important. We're working on a paper just now on kind of reassuring the psychology crowd that people who are, practicing clinical psychology or counseling or similar really have a massive role still to play. It's not that we're saying it just clears it up when you deal with the bio part, because actually, besides people still having issues in their life, and what you tend to find is that people still have the same stress but feel a lower strain. That's the sort of physicsy thing, is sort of gauging stress and strain. That people get more resilient, right? So they have that extra strength to draw on that you were talking about. But that there's other stuff that psychologists and other practitioners can help people with. I mean, it's so common for people we work with to get better, right? Which is great. But they may have been ill for years or decades. And there's very complex emotions come up out of that when suddenly they have to contend with a new version of themselves. It's very profound, and it can come with rage, grief, sadness. It's complicated. So after the initial euphoria, there can be a real soul search, and you can't just, keto your way out of soul searching. It doesn't work like that.
You can't keto the soul, I guess. But I think that's really a beautiful idea, because I think it just speaks to the systemic nature of like the human experience in general, where like you can address places where there might be dysregulation in the system happening. But like there's so many other aspects of the experience where like returning back to life, returning back to a state of well-being and health, like you said, it might lend itself to a huge amount of grief about all of the years spent dysregulated and dysfunctional, or rage about whatever experiences might have lent itself to that. So I think, zooming out in some like bigger perspective, just looking at these things systemically is really valuable, rather than just looking at kind of, for example, like a traditional pharmacological approach is just zooming in and looking for one particular molecular mechanism. And what happens oftentimes, or just with a lot of pharmacological interventions, is that, yeah, maybe there's a symptom improvement, but there's typically systematic, side effects as well. So you can't really avoid the systematic nature of all of these aspects of the biopsychosocial experience in general. So are you working
Absolutely.
with psychologists as well in your research at Oxford?
So Oxford, the team is multidisciplinary, but there's no psychologists in there. The paper that I'm working on right now is with Nicole Laurent, who is a counselor, mental health counselor in America, and Erin Bellamy, who's a clinical psychology PhD in Europe. So, Donika Hristova as well. She's a practitioner in the US. So we just submitted a paper for peer review on this subject, and I think it's important for any healthcare professional who's working with people's mental health to just be aware that this kind of therapy exists, that it's incredibly powerful, and that even if they don't want to actively get the tools to support people day to day with it around making, metabolic psychiatry principles apply to that person, that they should be aware so they don't kind of get in the way or ask someone to stop, because that can be disastrous if people just need a bit of support emotionally and they're being told to stop the thing which is allowing them to move on in their lives. So that's kind of hard, because I think people feel threatened and concerned, understandably, about something new, about the safety of it, about the claims being made. And that's partly why I wanted to be involved with the research, is that clinical data is one thing and anecdotes are powerful, especially when it comes to people getting better from such serious conditions. I think, if something is considered by the medical profession to be a chronic progressive illness, then you find all these anecdotes where people are getting better from it, then you have to take notice of those anecdotes, especially if you trust the healthcare professionals involved. But then you have to do the research too, and to really understand, because yeah, exactly, and quantify it and work out what the mechanisms are, because undoubtedly there's a portion of people for whom an off-the-shelf keto diet just doesn't work well. And so why do some people need to go carnivore to get those benefits? Why does even that not work for some people? And until you can answer that, you can't help everyone, which is a very frustrating place.
Yeah, right. So your research is on ketogenic diet for ADHD and depression. I'm just curious if you would talk a little bit about like potential mechanisms that you're investigating in terms of how the treatment outcomes are really mechanistically happening.
Yeah, so I think I have lots of ideas around mechanisms, and one of my favorite mediators of all this is microbiome, but I feel like the ability to properly analyze and understand that the microbiome as an intermediary is in its infancy. And so I don't think I'm confident enough to move ahead with that as a potential mechanism. It may be that we have the resources to take microbiome data from people. If that's the case, with all else being considered, then with all other measurements that we want to do being taken, then I would, just to see if something comes out of the data, because I think that it's clear stuff is mediated by the microbiome massively. There's such interesting stuff there. People can do fecal microbiota transplants. It tends to heal
Yeah.
C. difficile infections, pretty much 96% healed. And but people can transplant problems as well. You can transplant mood problems doing that. You can transplant mood improvements, but you have to be really careful about who the donor is, because there's stuff that comes with that is hard to predict. So it's definitely something there, but it's complicated. The gut microbiome is one of the most competitive places on earth. I think that affecting it reliably and repeatably, and being able to measure it properly and get analysis from it, and actually making a clean hypothesis prior, will be difficult. So what we're focusing on is blood ketone levels, which seems to have a clear effect. And there's multiple reasons why that may be good. So if people have higher blood ketones, then they typically have lower systemic inflammation, which is a good thing. Neuroinflammation is causal in mental disorder symptoms, so that's good. It's clear that brains like ketones. Ketones appear when we eat low carb or when we fast. So if we think about how we evolved, then our hunter ancestors, the ones who survived, would have been the ones who, over the course of a few days, would get keener and sharper at what they were doing as they hunted, whereas the ones who got duller and duller, when mentally, would be less likely to survive. So you can see there's a clear selection pressure on starvation fueling the brain better, and that's what we find, is that the brain prefers ketones. And I think this is like one of the reasons that mental sharpness and clarity is something that people talk about so much. They talk about a ketogenic diet, a fasting mimicking diet. When they started using them clinically for epilepsy more than 100 years ago, they were calling it a fasting mimicking diet because before that, the only thing that could help people with epilepsy was fasting. But of course, you can't do that indefinitely. Yeah. So I I think brains love ketones, lower systemic inflammation. I think it can starve pathogenic gut bacteria, which tend to enjoy sugar, starch the most. And so I think that's one reason that you find this rapid improvement is that gut microbiome changes quickly, but we're not going to try to measure that. So blood ketones, and we want to be using a mitochondrial test, which is to be confirmed. But the basic idea is that it'll check the genetics of the person to see if there's any potential pitfalls in their mitochondrial biology, which would most likely need an environmental trigger. But there are signatures there in the research, and it would find out any metabolites which would indicate low mitochondrial efficiency or bad mitochondrial health status, and that we hope that that will hopefully give us a smoking gun kind of set of at least phenotype people to understand biomarkers for their mental health and the severity at that particular time.
Yeah. So is the idea with kind of ketones in the brain that it increases mitochondrial efficiency, so the ability to like actually produce energy in the mitochondria, that ketones are actually just more efficient?
They are actually, yeah, than glucose. In the electron transport chain, you just get more bang for your buck in terms of ATP per molecule. So there's that. People who have been ill for a while can have glucose hypometabolism in the brain, so that not only is even outside the brain in the rest of the body are ketones more efficient, but that fatty acids are more efficient as well. Not all tissues take up ketones. They just use the fatty acids, but that in the brain you can't necessarily get as much insulin in to make the glucose work in the cell. So that if you've been ill for a while and you're not, you're needing more and more glucose to get more and more insulin to get the glucose to work, then it doesn't translate well into the brain. So you can get this hypometabolism or under usage of glucose in the brain. And when ketones come along, it's like all of a sudden you've got this really clean fuel source that just slots in perfectly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just make an interesting kind of correlate to make. I have been remiss not to mention some of my breathwork hypotheses, but it's just interesting to think about how also you see kind of the onset of different or like correlates of different types of psychiatric symptoms, especially like related to anxiety in people who are chronic overbreathers. So people who are not receiving a certain type of metabolic support in the form of oxygen delivery to the brain. So there's an inefficiency in the energy production just by the fact of like starvation from oxygen by over breathing or not breathing efficiently, and that you see like real correlates of anxiety is the biggest one, but potentially I'm interested in looking at how if it's really chronic, breathing disorders are really chronic, if it might be leading to like larger kind of symptomatic to the point of maybe being a diagnosis, or just not providing people the kind of support in order to maintain their homeostatic and allostatic function to where they might be less resilient to stress, or they might be unable to kind of regulate in response to inflammation or an infection or something that like. So just looking at the metabolism really as a foundation to a lot of these systems where things might be breaking down. And just another comment I wanted to make about the gut microbiome. I think that's also a really interesting one in terms of systemic thinking, because the gut microbiome really is an aspect of our body that doesn't contain the same genome as us. So like it's other organisms. It's like other organisms that have different evolutionary histories and different genetic codes that are vital to our survival. So like I forget the statistics around this, but there's a certain percentage of cells in our body that actually aren't ours, that actually don't share a genetic code. So like in terms of the symbiosis of all these different systems are necessary for kind of optimal flourishing. That speaks a little bit to this paradigm shift as well that I'm kind of trying to highlight here. Cool. Thank you for all of that. I'm aware of time, so I just wanted to ask you one last question, and you touched on this a little bit in terms of the electron transport chain, but I'm just curious if you have any insights about coming from a physics background. So I know that you were a PhD student in physics. Um, if there's any curiosities or any intersections between, your research or your understanding of physics and metabolic psychiatry, the kind of mechanisms of metabolism and systemic biology.
Yeah, so I actually started out at university studying English and film because I love books, poems, films, and I thought that'll be good. And then within a few months, I realized how big a mistake I'd made because the every time I was having to analyze these pieces of art, the patient would die by dissection, and it actually took me about 2 years after I left that course to read a novel again. I was traumatized by it. And so at the end of that year, I said, I'm going to switch what has one right answer that everyone can agree on. And
Mm.
so I switched to maths and physics, not realizing, of course, that a few years down the line, you start talking about quantum effects and that in any, just like in any research area, everyone you can always find someone who disagrees with a research finding. But that really appealed to me that it was a sort of shortcut way of understanding the universe. You learned the principles and then you applied them to problems. So you didn't have to like memorize lots of stuff. It was quite good. At the start of the physics exam, you get given all of the kind of physical constants. Whereas I think in a biology exam, sometimes the whole point is to remember the names of things. So it's quite a different focus. And I really liked that. That appealed to me. And that kind of first principles thinking, which of course isn't the only way of looking at things, but it gets under your skin. And so, yeah, I got my undergraduate degree and then I worked in industry for a few years applying that kind of problem solving tactic and then started the PhD. But again, I wasn't functioning well. And when I made that massive mental health change, I decided I had to help other people to do the same thing. So I was reading the literature in the background, and what I gravitated towards was, like you say, things like the electron transport chain, the absolute fundamentals of life that people like Nick Lane, if anyone's not read Nick Lane's book, The Vital Question, I can't recommend that enough. Yeah, that and Power, Sex, and Suicide, I think, is another one about mitochondria that he's done. And it's remarkable that how fundamental the electron transport chain and the mitochondria are. And so I love that. And if you really want to nerd out, Nick Lane and also the blog Hyperlipid has a legendary thread of posts called Protons, which really goes into all of that. And I think looking at it from the fundamentals, you start to understand just one, how complicated it is. We've been evolving essentially for billions of years. You can't even imagine what a billion years is. Like I've tried it a few times and or periodically I try it just to sort of, I don't know, while away the time or something. But you get like
The
back.
fundamental limitation of your human mind. Just can't.
Exactly. You just can't do it. It's like you get back 1,000 or 2,000 years, you're like, right, that's the time of the Romans and Jesus, etc. And then, the Etruscans 1,000 years before, and then you go back to the Sumerians, and then like the dawn, cradle of civilization. And before that, it's all misty, and you've got fossils and caves. But then you're only like 70, 100,000 years or whatever. You've got some fire remnants and things like that, which might go back a few 100,000 years or a couple of million to date
Then
us.
you start getting to before like mineral evolution. So before the kind of evolution of the periodic table of elements. And you're like, well, then what is there? What's going on?
Yeah, what does that even feel or look like? It's almost like trying to understand space-time and knowing that there's four dimensions, time being the fourth dimension. Like it just is not in our everyday experience. And so when you think about biological mechanisms
Mm.
and the idea that a drug could, you know, fix something which has gone wrong, which is billions of years old potentially, is ridiculous. And the sort of dozens of things that most chemicals in the body do because of this sort of symphony that goes on, everything working together in a way that's evolved
Mm.
and jostled for billions of years. The idea of getting back to fundamentals seems essential, because if you don't, you just get swamped. This is why actually I find mechanisms annoying a lot of the time, because although you need them to explain things properly, I just want to get right down to that kind of the most fundamental. And I think that's what's carried through with physics. It's like a lazy way of hacking the universe.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on something that I think about in quiet sometimes, but it's this taboo distinction between kind of synthetic and organic. About, there are organic processes that have evolved, these kind of organic fundamental mechanisms of the universe that are products of evolution. They're actually products of like the assembly of organic mathematics almost, or something mathematical about it. Versus, so for example, the processes of the evolution of the Krebs cycle as part of cellular respiration, which is the book of Nick Lane's that I read recently. Um, there's intelligence in how that system has evolved. So there's an organic nature versus something that's synthetic. For example, humans trying to develop a novel pharmaceutical, pharmacological agent. There's a synthetic nature to how that has been assembled. And so when you're talking about looking at fundamental mechanisms, for me, what I'm hearing is also looking at kind of some of the organic evolutionary processes that we're embedded in, rather than just trying to understand them from kind of a synthetic modern perspective.
Yeah,
Um,
totally. You know that I love that taboo around synthetic versus organic, and Nick Lane talking about hydrothermal vents potentially being the start of
yeah.
life, and that it was really just sort of, you know, inert things being put together and becoming ert, or whatever you would call it. And the this sort of Ian McGilchrist takes you so far with it, talking about the left and right hemisphere interplay, and the right hemisphere being like the master, sort of wise monarch type thing, and understanding the holistic whole. But I think he leaves off at that, and actually doesn't finds that to be a taboo, and doesn't like the idea that you could create something synthetic that would properly be like human intelligence. And I don't necessarily agree. And I think that there's a lot of room for human technology to grow to the point where we can do it, but I don't think it's impossible. And I think, like, we were discussing beforehand about the electron transport chain and what happens in that, and if there's any sort of quantum effects or just effects on a small scale, which could potentially explain some strange phenomena we see. And I'm totally open to that. We get shown this thing when I studied physics of where the probability of where an electron is around the nucleus of an atom. And you saw like two kind of humps with like a zero probability in the middle. So what that means physically is that in the sort of traditional atom diagram with the electrons sort of buzzing around, you find that you've got like two clouds that center around the nucleus, but it's never in between. And I
Mm.
asked my lecturer, how could it possibly be that it's at either side, but never crossing over? How does it get to the other side? And he said, we don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. But I mean, that's what older researchers tend to say, like, oh, I don't think we'll ever know. I've not done it, so no one will ever do it. And this is a very talented person. But the yeah, the mystery around these things is understandably, awe-inspiring. I think, you find quantum effects that have been discovered in the last few years, like in birds' eyes. Birds use quantum entanglement
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
navigate. And so they're, this sort of spooky action at a distance of photons being entangled, and then something that happens to the photon at point A happens simultaneously at point B. In, yeah, regardless of the distance between them. Now, they can explain what happens, but how do you explain why that happens? if you assume that the speed of the speed of light is finite and is the speed limit of the universe, there's a lot of things that still don't make sense. And I think it would be really interesting to see if anyone's able to crack proper general intelligence using these principles, and I think that would be a good thing.
Yes, I have so much to say. You've unlocked so many doors on Pandora's box, but really, I think an idea that speaks a little bit to polarity is like this idea you're mentioning of quantum physicists. There's always some kind of um, fundamental mystery that you have to believe in sometimes. Like um, Terence McKenna has this quote about like there's science asks of you one fundamental mystery, some fundamental magic, which is the belief of the Big Bang happening in the first place. And there's this poet Borges who's like I think he's Argentinian, but he talks about these eternal crevices of unreason, and like really believing in a fundamental mechanistic universe always asks of you the belief in some kind of eternal crevice of unreason. And I think that crevice is where mystery emerges, and where like yeah, where like these organic processes have emerged from in the first place. And I think also this idea of being able to both hold fundamental mechanisms about something and principles of the organic intelligence of systems, but also holding the truth of like there's still fundamentally some unreason or mystery. It's like you have to kind of hold the polarity of both of those being true, and both of those being in relationship to one another. And that's kind of the generative tension of things. And I think it just to tie in Ian McGilchrist here also, I think it speaks a little bit to the fundamental principle in some of his work, which is that the brain has kind of bilateralized its functions through the process of complexity, of the development of complexity. So, one side of the brain is more responsible for specific honing in on, being able to focus the attention really closely. And another region of the brain is responsible for systematic thinking. And it's almost like, yeah, as the brain evolves in its complexity, the polarization needed to split because there's these two kind of polarized functions which make the entire whole. And it's the kind of tension and paradox between those two things which like generate creation in the first place. So I'm sorry you've opened these Pandora's boxes for me, but the last thing I wanted to say was about AGI, artificial general intelligence, and like I think there's something to be said about mathematics and mathematical principles also potentially being organic, in the sense of like, utilizing math and algorithms and creating algorithms that are generative. They're not always synthetic because we've organized them together. That also like the way that numbers interact with each other also has this organic principle to it. So for example, like the principles behind why there can only be 2 electrons in the first cloud, and why there can only be, I think it's 5 electrons in the next cloud. I don't know, you tell me. But there's principles underlying that also that are mathematical limitations that are actually intelligent. So when we're using math and creating algorithms, potentially those are organic also. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I
um,
love that thought. I would say as well that the sort of what was it, eternal crevices of unreason.
yeah,
That sounds like something that I had before I changed my diet. But the I love the concept, and I think the idea of like things being alive is very interesting. I don't know if you've read The Hidden Spring, the Mark Soames book.
you've
Um,
mentioned.
yeah, and the distinction to be made about the what it's like to be somethingness.
Yeah,
So what's it like to be uh what's it like to be a grouse that's being shot at? What's it like to be a flower when winter's approaching? What what's that like? And I think like Ian McGilchrist talks about the embodiment of experience. And I think this is something that's hard about explaining metabolic psychiatry, is that you really have to experience it to know it. If you've gone through these types of problems and you still are, then it's easy for me to say, you can get better. You might listen to that. You might get hope from that if you hear that other people have. You might even be more compelled if there's more research and better mechanistic understanding. Um, and as the amount of clinical anecdotes and research grow. But the way that persuades most people, I think, is the metaphors that people use who have successfully done it. Because it's really hard to translate an experience to words. So people talk about the clouds parting and the sun shining through for the first time in years,
Mm.
or like they can see clearly. You know, you need metaphors to carry that feeling as much as possible, and they're usually not strong enough to, you can't make someone experience something. But I think that is the thing. What's it like to be better from a mental illness? I
Right.
think that's the hope that metabolic psychiatry provides.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think there's something to be said also about the experience of being alive also being defined in some way by metabolism. Because as far as I understand it, the distinction I've made is really the kind of distinction or the Markov's blanket, if you will, between biological systems and physical systems is the ability to generate its own energy, the ability to kind of defy entropy in the creation of its own energy. And so having, designing an intervention, which is really fundamentally rooted in the relationship that we have to our own ability to produce energy is a really direct relationship to our experience of being actually alive. So thank you for this conversation. It's been fascinating. I know you are recruiting participants for a couple of studies coming up. So I just want to give you a chance to maybe give some shout outs to where people might be able to find you or to participate in your research or just learn more.
Yeah, sure. So the pilot studies coming up, recruiting right now and ongoing into sort of September, October this year, where we're asking people to come with CGM, continuous glucose monitor, an Oura Ring or Apple Watch or similar that can measure heart rate variability and that kind of thing. And um, we'll coach them to using ketogenic diets, to using the principles of metabolic psychiatry, and we'll ask them to log their mood and cognition. And what we want to ultimately have in the longer term is a closed loop, so that if people are wearing the right wearables like CGM, like Oura Ring, and they're logging their mood and cognition, that we'll be able to learn what their signatures are like, so that if something comes up in their data that allows them, that precedes, that is in the past preceded a mental health episode, we can flag up a little notification and say, like, maybe in an hour or a day or a week, you're going, in the past you have felt bad after this signature, but don't worry, in the past when you've done X, Y, and Z, it's righted these problems. And I think we'll be able to find out really fascinating stuff on a user and population level. So being part of this pilot, it really is at the cutting edge of metabolic psychiatry, where we're combining that passively taken wearable data with the human connection that people usually want and need when it comes to coaching. And they'll be getting, group and one-to-one coaching as part of the program. So anyone who's interested, they can just email me, ally@metsci.com, ALLY at metpsy.com, or find me at Ali Transforms on Twitter or Instagram. And it'd be great to meet and to get you on board.
Cool. Well, I'm interested, and so I'll be in touch about all that. Thank you for your time. This has been fascinating. Um, thank you.